Okay. Any other questions you guys want me to talk about before we go back into finishing up our lecture on the lower extremity? All right. Remember, guys, if you don't want to talk, you can always throw things up on the group chat, and I'll be more than happy to go ahead and answer questions that way. So, we left off talking about the foot. So we've got the tarsometatarsals and the intermetatarsals. So now we're talking about what we would typically think of as kind of the midfoot. Okay? Now, these are joints that permit gliding movements. So they can move back and forth on one another, and this is what enables our foot to function as a semi-rigid unit, meaning that it's going to move around and flatten out depending on what surfaces we're on. So, like for example, I'm standing up right now, and if you guys hopefully can, wherever you're at, go and stand up, and then you can feel how you can purposely roll your ankle in, and then you can literally flatten out the arch of your foot, just like you can then curl your toes in the ground, and you can feel that arch come out, and then you can roll into the outside of the foot. Now, this is good because it turns out it's going to allow our foot to change shape so that it's going to be able to get traction on whatever surface we're walking on. Now, the metatarsal phalangeal, and interphalangeal joints we're talking about are toes. Okay, these are cotyledon and hinge joints. Okay, this is going to allow us to shift our weight appropriately whenever we're moving, and it's going to allow us to maintain stability. So I'm sure every single person here has done something like they've stubbed their toe or otherwise, and they couldn't use one of their toes, and the awkwardness of trying to move without being able to grasp the floor a little bit as we move, as we're shifting onto the ball of our foot, and then gripping still a little bit with the front of the foot. Does that make sense? So, connecting in between there, we have what's known as our plantar arches. Now, that is going to be where, turns out, we've got a massive band of mostly tendinous tissue that is going to do some pretty interesting things, in that what it's going to allow us to do is it's going to store and return kinetic energy. Because this connective tissue, running all the way from our calcaneus to our forefoot, is literally going to stretch and then return the energy when we're running. Now, when we're running, when we're jumping or otherwise, where do we need to effectively land and then push off in order to use this advantage? Or should I say, be able to use it more so? Where do we need to land in order for this to happen? Austin, what do you think?
So where do we need to, how do we need to land?
Yeah, where do we need to put force through our foot in order to really take advantage of this the most?
Probably like the ball of your foot, like right up on your toe.
Exactly. Yep. And same thing, Blaine just put that up in the chat. Yeah, we need to be landing on the ball of our foot. So we need to be landing and effectively with our foot strike up onto our toe. Now, when you see people jogging, where are they typically landing with their foot?
On the heel.
Good. Now, what's the problem with landing with your heel?
Right. Shoot. Would it be less energy, like stored up?
Less energy is absolutely correct. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, guys, when you have somebody who's running and they're actually striking with their heel, okay, think about your center of gravity and where your body has to be hitting. So go ahead and stand up wherever you're at. And if you put your foot behind you, naturally, what part of your foot is touching the ground? So you're standing on one leg, and then you take the opposite leg and you touch the ground behind you. What part of your foot is touching the ground?
Ball of your foot.
Yeah, naturally the ball of your foot. Now, let's go ahead and put that foot in front of you. What part of your foot naturally wants to touch the ground first?
Heel.
So the problem with a lot of people that are heel strikers when they're running is they're literally hitting the brake pedal each time because their heel is hitting the ground in front of them, literally helping stop their body. Then they roll onto the front of the foot and push off again. Whereas if you're hitting with the ball of your foot, you're hitting with your weight right on top of yourself, which is going to still keep you up in the air. And then it's immediately behind you so you can push yourself forward. So you're literally more efficient with your running gait. So Colleen, if you don't mind, since obviously your sport is effectively running, what if anything, do your coaches, do they really coach you guys much on technique, or is this ever anything that's brought up for you guys?
Not really. If you're running in college, you should probably know how to run by now.
Fair enough. Now, whenever you guys are running, is effectively being a predominantly heel striker, is that something you see too often in the collegiate level?
Not really.
Where do you see it then? Not that you're necessarily looking for it.
I guess with like younger athletes that don't really know.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you, guys. So, well, what's allowing our toes to move? Well, when it comes to flexion, we're talking about our digitorum longus, and that's the one that's going all the way through, brevis, which is much shorter, the quadratus plantae, our lumbricals, and our interossei. Now, for extension, so lifting our feet up, the extensor hallucis longus, and remember that's a two-joint one coming from the tibia, digitorum longus, and brevis. So brevis being the shorter muscle in the foot, longus obviously being one that links up further. Remember, that's also going to help with dorsiflexion of the ankle. Now, as far as inversion and eversion of the foot, we've got our tibialis posterior and anterior. That's going to help with inversion, so turning that foot in. Then for eversion, we have our peroneus longus, brevis, and tertius. Now, there's a number of misalignments of the lower extremity that effectively naturally occur. This can be sometimes due to things like rickets, vitamin D deficiency, which is thankfully relatively rare these days, or it can just be more or less just a skeletal differences between one individual and another. And the first one is going to be what's known as knee varus and knee valgus. Knee varus is commonly referred to as being bow-legged, and knee valgus is commonly referred to as what? It's going to be commonly referred to as being knock-kneed. So you can see with the individual that's valgus, their knee is, and their joint is actually slightly inside of what would be the center line of gravity for the leg, and then knee varus is when they're going to be able to buckle out. So an easy way to see this is if you have somebody go ahead and put their feet together, and then, do not climb my back, Tinks, do not climb my back, is you're going to see their knees either touching before their feet do, or you're going to see a gap between their knees when their ankles are touching. Now, the problem is both of these are going to lead to extra strain. Sorry, she's not hopping on the desk again today. it's going to lead to extra strain and specifically a little bit of extra tension and compression on one side of the joint compared to the other. So someone that has naturally knee varus, what side of the knee do you think is going to potentially give them more issues? Yeah. Now they're going to have, if you notice there, compression on the medial and then tension on the lateral. And the antithesis is going to be true with someone with valgus. But then think about the line of pull of the quad, of how somebody with valgus, the quad is naturally be pulling away from the midline, and it's going to be pulling more laterally with the patella, and then vice versa. So this is something that occurs. I'm actually knock-kneed myself, or I have knee valgus, just from the way my bone structure is. And then you're going to come across athletes that have knee varus. In fact, Dmitry Klokov, who's a very successful Olympic lifter, he has pretty obvious knee varus, and yet he was still one of the best in the world. Now, another different, or I guess you'd say modification you have, is what's known as anteversion. And that's where literally the femoral neck and head, instead of pointing in its typical angle. Jinx, what is going on, girl? My God. I apologize, guys. You just like make me multitask while I teach. So what we're going to see is naturally there's actually effectively a twisting there. So when their feet are pointing straight up, their kneecaps are nearly kissing because they're internally rotated, literally through twisting through the effectively the femoral neck. So the femur is effectively twisted. And the same thing, in order to get their kneecaps to face forward, they actually have to have their feet turned out massively. And this is a slight differential, the thing that you can find. We actually currently have one of the girls in the cheerleading squad that she has femoral anteversion. Literally, when she's sitting down, she has to turn her feet out almost to about 60 degrees in order for her kneecaps to actually be facing up, because they naturally are that far twisted in. And then we've got what's known as retroversion, which is going to be twisting to the opposite direction. So instead, the kneecaps are naturally be pointing more out to the sides than in through the center whenever their feet are pointed straight up. And turns out this is going to lead to some biomechanical repercussions in that the knee joint can obviously be getting a greater amount of shear on one side or the other, depending on which way effectively that they have this angular difference. Now, another change that you can have is literally the femoral angle. So the angle of the neck coming off of the shaft of the femur can be both greater and lesser than normal. And it turns out, as you'd suspect, individuals that have a greater angle can in fact have more weight straight distributed underneath themselves. So it's going to arguably make certain things a little bit easier, and or technically can probably get into a deeper splits because they're not going to have to worry about their trochanter effectively running into their hip bone. Whereas someone that has a coxavera, they're literally just going to hit bone on bone because they're literally running into that trochanter much earlier, and that's going to limit their hip mobility, specifically in abduction. Now, I'm sure a number of you guys have heard of Q angles before. What are they and why do they matter? What's a Q angle and why do they matter? Go ahead, guys, whenever you're ready. Just take a guess. Have you guys never heard of a Q angle before? No, no, it's not the distance between the patella and the quad tendon. Kylie, have you ever heard of a Q angle when we talking about the legs? Fair enough. All right. So your Q angle, guys, is going to be the natural angle that you're going to find between effectively where the shaft of the femur starts into the knee joint. So individuals that have broader hips naturally have a greater Q angle. Now, having a greater Q angle in turn is going to get it so that you have a greater amount of effectively shearing, not so much sort of shearing, but that tension compression stress being asymmetrical in the knee joint. Because like anything else, literally just running with this greater Q angle is going to in effect cause greater impact, which in turn is more the body has to recover from. So it literally becomes harder and harder to be a long distance runner. And I'm sorry, Colleen, I'm going to pick on you again. Do you ever see legitimately broad long distance runners? I'm referring to not just the broad shoulders, but literally, have you ever competed against a very good cross country runner? So this is on the collegiate level that has broad hips, like really wide hips.
No.
And the reasoning for that, guys, is because it turns out those people get selected against because it's literally anatomically harder to be a good long distance runner with wide set hips. And fun fact, because obviously I enjoy oversharing way too much, literally before my wife got pregnant, because pregnancy actually does change the angles of the hips a little bit in women, specifically due to the hormones, my hips are wider than my wife's and we're the same height. So arguably she's the one that has the body type to be a long distance runner. And, you know, I have the body type of a orangutan. And so when you're working with individuals, if you encounter someone that just literally has just a wide skeletal structure, long distance running is not a great choice for them in the idea of trying to become a very high level athlete and or getting up to incredibly high mileages because they're literally suffering greater impact. Cat! You are damn, yep, you're going to the floor. Okay, you know, I don't need coffee. I just get cat claws into my back, and I need to start wearing thicker t-shirts whenever I teach. So, but getting back to it, with that greater Q angle, once again, they're going to naturally get more impact. Now, typically, women have broader hips than men, but that's, once again, based on the word typically. There are some guys that have got wider hips, and there's some gals that have narrower hips, and that's coming down to a wide variety of things like genetics. Now, there's also going to be what's known as femoral torsion, which is just kind of like the anteversion and retroversion we were talking about earlier, only now this is going to be obviously at the end of the femur, no longer at the neck, and effectively right off the shaft of the femur. Now, same type situation, this is going to cause internal external rotation, which in turn, is going to lead to greater amount of stresses from doing just consistent linear impacts. Now, it is giving you a slight disadvantage for change of direction, otherwise, just because you're suffering a little bit more of an asymmetrical force that you're having to absorb. But like anything else, it's just something to be aware of, because you might have an athlete, and it's not like every athlete can just go ahead and sit down into the bottom of the squat with their feet straight forward and their knees out. Some folks do those changes in the hip neck angle, in changes of their femoral angle, and even with tibial torsion later on, lower down the body in the tibia. You just need to be mindful of the fact that due to those differences, they're going to literally have to have slightly different technique whenever they're setting up to do something like a squat, in order so that they can do it in a way that's orthopedically as minimally stressful, so they're going to be able to get the most out of it. Now, go figure, there's a myriad of issues we can have. One of the potential knee issues is going to be with someone's chondromalacia, and that's going to be literally when that kneecap is getting driven into the femur a bit too much, and it turns out that's going to occur from overstressing the joint compared to what it can recover from. I'm sure everybody's had some knee pain before. It could be tendonitis, can be patellar tendon pain, this can be quad tendon pain, this could be a lot of other issues, and quite frequently the knee suffers when effectively it has to make up for the mobility, or it's improperly angled thanks to the mobility and strength of the hips and the ankles, in order to keep it in a good biomechanical position to appropriately absorb and produce force. So that's the lower extremity, guys. What else would you guys like to talk about? Nothing else you guys want to talk about? You guys are good?
Do we have a quiz and a group quiz?
It's a great question. Give me one moment and I will go ahead and double check on that. And since that'll be an easy question to answer, we're going to keep on talking. Okay. So all these quizzes, when they're open, they'll have due dates up on Blackboard. So it's like anything else, guys. You just got to keep consistently checking into it. Example programs, you got math. Yep, you guys got your group quiz and individual quiz all over the lower extremity to take at some point today and or through the next couple days. So got, and we'll kick that back a little bit. Yep, I see, Blaine. I'm just getting that moved so you guys have got more time for the group quiz and the individual quiz.
There's actually 21 grams.
No, Kylie, I just removed it so there's no password that you guys need to have. You guys ready to start talking about bones? See, you're a good puppy. Because you don't try to call me to get attention. You just come over here and sit down. So yesterday, Norbs and I went for a walk. Norbs hates social distancing. We walked by 2 different puppies and at least 2 or 3 groups of people, and he can't get pets from anybody. Now, when he was a puppy, Like, I mean, it was like he was a child actor. Like everybody loved him, everybody wanted to pet him, like everyone would hang out. But now that he's a big dog, it turns out a lot of people can be. Yes, I stopped petting you. A lot of people can start to get a little nervous just because he's a big dog, but he's super friendly. And so he'll literally like make like this little like crying noise. And oh my God, every time we walk by another dog and he can't, go say hello and sniff on that dog, he just freaks out. And it's just like, oh man, I'm sorry, buddy. I'm sorry. Like, I think he thinks he's being a bad dog or something. It's like, no, you're a good dog. It's just turns out everyone can have the plague. And we are going to make sure mommy does not get the plague. Ain't that right, buddy? You and I will go for another walk today. Yes, we will. So, you guys ready to start talking about some bone growth and development? It's okay to unmute yourself and say something to me, because right now I feel like a raving lunatic talking to himself in a room in his house while his dog puts his surprisingly bony butt on his foot, which is rather invigorating, seeing as how I managed to put his, what would be his ilium directly down upon my metatarsals, which surprisingly seems to be making those gliding joints opening up a little bit, which is not that invigorating. But he's a good dog, so he'll get pets. Because love is pain, right, Norbs? Love is pain, yes. Yeah, Norbs, I'm still talking to myself, dude. Sometimes I think this is all hallucination. Oh no, Tinks, no. No claws in my back. All right. So it turns out you got bones. Bones you have varying levels of stiffness. Now, this is literally going to be a ratio of a stress to strain. Now, stress is going to be effectively when we're looking at how much force it takes in order to literally start to change the shape of that bone. Now, most of our bones are not very good at the ability to change shape because we try to make them change shape too much. What do we typically call that with our bones? All right, Celia, what do we call it whenever we make our bones change shape? Typically?
I don't know.
Okay. So if we were to take your, let's say, well, let's not take yours, this is going to be, no one's going to want this to happen, okay? If we were to take your, just the radius of your ulna, so one of the bones of your forearm, and we were to make that change shape, how do we typically get it to change shape?
Break it?
Yeah. Do we want to break our bones?
No.
It's not meant to be a trick question, guys. It's not meant to be a trick question. So all the bones have what's known as compressive strength, and that's literally their ability to resist being compressed. It's not like you lift weights heavy once, then all of a sudden your arms get shorter, or my arms have gotten longer from heavy deadlifting. Like, no, it turns out they're really good at keeping this position. And that's going to be due to literally the amount of mineralization that we have. And that's literally going to be coming down to the amount of calcium that's being incorporated into our bones. Now, the greater amount of calcium we have incorporated into our bones relative to the size of the bone is literally what's known as the bone mineral density. Individuals with higher bone mineral densities have literally stronger bones. And we'll get into a number of nutritional concerns for how to approach that later on. Now, how does effectively the way bones are structured affect their ability to deal with strength? Well, it turns out bones are oriented, and what's really cool is, thanks to what we'll get into in a little bit, is they're constantly adapting to the demands placed upon it. And specifically, whenever you apply enough stress on the bone to effectively cause some cellular signaling, it's literally going to not just build more density in the bone, but build more density in the bone in organization that allows it to overcome the forces it just had to absorb. So your bones are really good with dealing with straight up compression. They're not as great with tension, so pulling them apart, and they're even worse with shearing force. And if you guys want to induce a desire to not eat, Google arm wrestling spiral fractures, because that's a great example of that shear force going through the bone, and literally you'll just see somebody's arm, their humerus just snap and their arm spin back, because it's no longer literally a complete humerus to produce that force across. Now, what's going to give us the flexibility that we have is going to be collagen. Now, collagen is going to be a mostly protein-based component of our bones. And yes, it does decrease in quality a little bit as we get older, but like anything else, our body, from our skeleton to our muscles to our skin to our nervous system, is constantly remodeling every day. It's plastic. It's all changing. And so if you can go ahead and apply appropriate stresses to keep that tensile strength in those areas, you're going to be more resilient. Now, this also means, in order to avoid things like increasing your fracture rate when you get to be older, you have to be dealing with greater forces. And by dealing with greater forces, well, it's the forces typically that the muscles are producing. And on top of that, it's going to be obviously the lifestyle that you're leading. Now, the problem with a lot of people, what population has the highest risk of osteoporosis?
The elderly.
Good. What type of elderly individual actually has a higher risk from there? Older women. Good. And what type of older women? What type of older women, Blaine? Yep, part of it is through menopause, so that is obviously an older woman. Turns out with the loss of typical estrogen and progesterone production, it's going to cause some issues with bone mineral density, but that's not the major cofactor of really increasing osteoporosis risk. Okay. Amani, give us a guess. What type of older women do you think are going to have a higher risk aside from postmenopausal? I'm just going to unmute a lot of you guys to give you guys a chance to talk, and or we'll find out if somebody's listening to something else while they're doing this or having to deal with their wonderful roommates. Catherine, what type of older women do you think have a higher risk?
I don't know, this might be stupid, but if they're already having if they're already kind of sick in a way.
Yeah. Now, you're correct, but I want you to think about it based upon the demands. Your bones are only as dense as they need to be to deal with your activities of daily living. So if you're someone that's been chronically sick, what have you probably not been doing? Good. Now, it's not just sedentary women, but you're absolutely correct with that, Blaine. Keep going, Catherine. Let's talk our way through it.
Okay, wait, what's the question again?
What type of older women, aside from being sedentary, have a greater risk of osteoporosis, osteopenia?
I don't know.
Okay, so you figure they've got much lower demands for their skeleton to be denser. Okay, so if you just went to the retirement home, okay, you saw the one lady who's working out, still, she's getting out, she's walking, she's lifting weights, etc. And then you see the other woman that just sits all day. Who do you think has got the higher risk for osteoporosis?
The one that's sitting all day?
Good. Okay. Now you've got two women that are sitting all day, but they still, they get up out of bed, they walk wherever they walk around, they get up, they go sit down in the living room, they get up, they go sit down in the kitchen, but they at least move around a little bit. Okay. So that they're still getting some of that signal of okay, I need some bone mineral density. But now we're going to say the difference between the two of them is one of them weighs as much as I do, and the other of them weighs as much as Colleen does, which mathematically speaking is nearly half as much as I do. Who do you think has got the higher risk of osteoporosis?
And both of them don't really do anything?
They're both doing the same, pretty much very little amount of physical activity. Effectively, the one that's twice the size of the other, or the one that's much smaller?
The smaller one?
Say it like a statement, not a question.
The smaller one?
Yes. Now, why would that be?
Just because they're already little, and so they probably don't have much muscle or anything, and they're probably just weak.
Okay. Now, it's not necessarily, there's nothing wrong with being a smaller human. There's nothing wrong with being a bigger human, but you're absolutely on the right course when you think about if two people are very sedentary, and then on top of that, they happen to be very small. Well, it turns out, so, Tinks, our house cat, she's the one clawing me in the back throughout this morning and singing us the song of her people in the background on occasion. She weighs about 10 pounds. Norbert weighs about $115, and then I weigh about 210, 215. I haven't weighed myself for a while because I've been eating my feelings because I really don't like talking to screens and speaking into the silence. Now, my bones are going to be denser than that cat because literally when that cat walks around, it only has to move a 13-pound body. It only has to deal with the impacts of a 13-pound body jumping and landing. Whereas when Norbert runs around, he's got to deal with the impacts of a 115-pound body, which naturally is literally 10 times the amount of force, at least, because we think about force equals mass times acceleration. They're both dealing with the same acceleration of gravity. The one is dealing with a greater amount of mass. And then obviously I have to deal with more. Now, when it comes to those, once again, the risk population for osteoporosis, smaller, older women have the greatest risk for osteoporosis because literally their bones don't have to be that dense to start in order to just allow you to hold your head up, in order to keep your posture up, in order to walk around a room because you literally have a lighter body. Now, obviously, I think most of you guys are not looking to strap on all these weight vests so that you constantly have to have a greater amount of force going through your skeleton. Instead, think of it along the lines of you just need to be dealing with enough impacts and enough force production in order to tell your skeleton, hey, I need to be denser, I need to be stronger so that I can in fact deal with it. In fact, one thing that we were working with a little bit with our research back when the world was still functioning normally was looking at the relationships of bone mineral density to lean body mass. And what you find is individuals who naturally have a higher lean body mass also have a higher bone mineral density because their skeleton has to be stronger to deal with the forces those muscles are producing. So now here's the other thing to keep in mind. If you are 90 years old right now, okay? So if somebody is 90 years old in 2020, what year were they born in? You can either put it in the chat or you can go and say it out loud.
What was the question?
If you are 90 years old right now, okay, what year were you born in? Thank you.
2011.
You were born in 1930, okay?
Wait, did you say 9 or 90?
90.
Oh, I thought you said 9. My bad.
Oh yeah, 9, yes, they were born in 2011. There you go, math. If I could enunciate, that would be better. Now, if you were a guy born in 1930, okay, as opposed to if you were a woman born in 1930, that means you were a teenager in, obviously, you know, the 1940s. And then, you know, you were in your 20s in the 50s, you were in your 30s in the 60s. Now, when you were female, specifically in this 90-year-old example, what type of athletic opportunities did you have normally, or shall we say on average, in the US in the 1940s and 50s? A big side over. We'll go for a walk later, buddy. Well, guys, perfect answer. It's pretty much what you put out there, which was damn near nothing. Because what were the athletic opportunities for females really in the 40s and 50s?
It was nothing.
There's very little. I mean, there's maybe, I mean, the original basketball, now don't get me wrong, this is like early 1900s. Women had to play in full wrist length and ankle length dresses, and they were not allowed to dribble the ball. Like the original swimsuits for women were all cotton, and women actually initially had to swim in dresses with corsets. And then when they realized a bunch of women were drowning because, you know, they're effectively trying to swim in full clothing, they finally allowed women to actually wear, you know, something that's just covering enough of the skin for societal acceptance, but not going to let them die. Meanwhile, dudes were literally swimming nude on average. So the problem when we look at some of this older data is you have to keep in mind the context of the time. So like my parents were born in the 50s. So it turns out, you know, my dad played a lot of sports growing up. That was very normal. My mom had a little bit of access to sports, but nowhere near as much. Now, women that were born in the 70s, and specifically talk about being in the post-Title IX era, they've had a lot more athletic opportunities. So it's going to be very interesting to see how risk for osteoporosis of my generation and your generation change because, well, it turns out there is more accessibility to sport, but obviously on average, Americans are more sedentary. So are we going to see an uptick in osteoporosis, specifically in male populations? But we're going to see a downtick in female populations because of, once again, athletic opportunities. Does that make sense to you guys? Well, I like how I'm getting a little bit of the background life of Austin right now. That's awesome. So a decent fraction of your bone happens to be water. And it's good that your bones have a certain amount of porousness, because this is going to be where we're having this turnover, and along with this is where your bone marrow is naturally occurring. Now, we have what's known as two different categories of bone. We have our cortical bone, and that is going to be effectively the bone that is very minimally porous, and it's mostly just solid. So that's the solid center or exterior of our bones, specifically in the center of them when we're talking about things like the femur. Then we've got what's known as trabecular bone, and this is where we've got a lot of porosity, and this is at the very end of our bones and the vertebrae. This is where we've got a lot more of that plasticity, so we can literally develop a greater amount of bone mineral density and hence strength to deal with the forces that we happen to be encountering. Now, whenever we go and we look at the two of these and their effects, we're going to see that the cortical bones are going to be pretty stiff, okay? But they can't deal with a lot of strain, that's why they break, okay? Our trabecular bones actually are going to allow some strain and some shifting, which is going to cause that signaling in the bones in order to tell us to increase bone mineral density, which in turn is going to make it so we're less likely to fracture them. Now, this is also going to be what your growth plates are made up of. And since we know your growth plates happen to be made of a spongier bone that literally cannot deal with as much stress, what does that tell us as a practitioner when we're working with kids, specifically having them work out and attempting maximal lifts?
Bones are easier to break.
Bingo. And so if the bones are easier to fracture in kids, specifically, they're on the other side of puberty. So they literally still are a child developmentally. Now, let's face it, some of us mentally are children for our entire life. But what does that tell you about, let's say you become a high school strength and conditioning coach and you're working with the freshman class of boys and girls? What does that tell you in the weight room as far as maxing them out? Should everybody be maxed out?
No.
Bingo. Because it turns out the kids that are not fully developed, meaning when we're talking about that developmental age, their bones aren't fully formed. They don't have a fully formed skeleton. So you're really increasing the risk of injury, especially your risk of injury increases during your growth spurt, because that's where your bone mineral density is actually at its lowest, because your bones are getting longer at such a quick rate, along with now you've got a longer lever arm, so you can literally, you're absorbing greater torques than your body's ever been used to. So aside from having a neurological disadvantage, you have a major mechanical disadvantage, which literally increases injury rates. And so one of the coolest things that I've seen recently, are you guys familiar with European soccer, specifically some of the soccer teams in the UK?
Not very.
That's okay. I'm sure some of you guys have heard of like Manchester United. Arsenal, which is the Gunners. Go ahead. Okay, well, somebody's doing the dishes in the background. That's cool. So what you're going to find, it was really neat. It was a guy who's currently the head of the sports development for Arsenal's soccer club. They literally take the heights. Well, first and foremost, you are into the pipeline to potentially play professional soccer when you're 8 years old in the UK. And then they put you in 8 and under, and then 10 and under, 12 and under, 14, 16, 18, 22, and then you're either a pro or you didn't make it. So when they have those, they literally take heights on these kids once a week. So when they're able to actually infer when the kid is hitting their growth spurt, they purposefully change their training to be more about mobility work and neurological control, and cut back the resistance training and their impacts, because they find they're statistically significantly way more likely to get hurt during that period of time, because their body is developing at such a rate that, once again, they're dealing with those greater forces, and they're not as good, because it's the equivalent of doing everything with gophers. They're not used to dealing with that greater range of motion. And so because of that, it's going to really throw off and decrease their movement quality. And it's an important thing to understand when we're dealing with developing humans, in that, yeah, their skeleton is not fully formed. And so hence, what's the point of spending all this time and money to develop these athletes and then get them hurt for really no good reason? Actually, it was really, there's a lot of really cool things they do. Another thing, aside from tracking the height of the athlete and making sure that they're progressing them appropriately, and this is something that I really liked because it's the opposite of effectively the American sporting model, is if you are the coach of the 8 and under team, the 10 and under team, the 12, so you're literally working with little kids. And now, mind you, this is trying to get them to be professional soccer players at some point. You literally have the same income as if you're working with the 18, 22 and others, and even the professional ones as a strength and conditioning coach, which literally means there's no incentive to go work with the pros over the little kids unless you just really want to be with that age. So it's not like in the US where if you really want to make money as a strength coach and make really good money, you've got to make it to one of the top tier schools. And if you're working at a D3 or a D2, their salaries typically are much lower. And there's not that difference in the incentive model here. Instead, you could work at any of those levels, get paid well, and then you can work with the population you want to. But I digress. Let's talk about some types of bones. The first big difference we're going to have is between our axial and our appendicular skeleton. So axial, we're talking about our head, and then we're talking about our spinal column along with our rib cage. Now, our appendicular is everything else. So arms, scapula, and clavicle, literally our hips and our legs. Now, from there, we've got 4 different classifications. We've got our short bones. So these are going to be like our carpals and our tarsals. We have flat bones, and these are going to be things like our scapula, our ribs, where we're going to have a lot of attachments to it and or organs being protected by it. We then have what's known as irregular bones, which I love because it's like the bucket you throw things in where it's like, it's weird. And so that's going to literally be like our vertebrae, sacrum, coccyx. And then we have got our long bones, and that's going to be things like our humerus, things like our femur. Now, we're going to see that our bones are growing at the ends, okay? And these are what's known as the epiphyseals. Now, the epiphyseal plates, those are literally the growth plates that you've heard referred to whenever we're looking at someone that happens to be developing. Now, these are going to close, and when these close, congratulations, that bone is as long as it's going to be for your entire life, unless you want to break literally there are some examples where they break somebody's leg and then put it in traction in order to increase the length of the bone. That can be because people literally have asymmetric limb lengths, and that is definitely not something that I would probably have most of you guys sign up to do. Now, once again, when these growth plates close, it is going to be different depending on a myriad of things. We've got genetics involved, we've got lifestyle involved, we've got nutrition involved. All of those are going to be influencing what effectively is going to be our maximal height. So go ahead and in the chat, guys, at what age were you when you were your current height? So effectively, when did you hit your peak height? Okay, now I come from Missouri. Some people's sophomore year happened whenever they were 18 to 22 years old because they kind of had repeat grades a couple times. So nice, Cam didn't peak out until late. Thank you, Kylie. Okay. Celia, you were that tall when you were 13 years old? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to unmute you for a second because this is interesting to me. How much were you towering over all of your classmates?
I've been taller than my whole class, like my whole life.
Dear God. Like when you hit your peak height, was there really even anybody in your grade that was like even up to your shoulder?
No, the guys started catching up in high school.
Let me guess, it sucked, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. My wife and I are the same height. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm obviously not as tall as you. My wife's 5'10", but yeah, she was taller than her older sister when she was 4 years old and her sister was 6. And then, she's been taller than both her mom and her sister since she was like 10. So yeah, the joys of how we all develop at different ages. And then Cam, how much did you grow after you left high school?
I was probably about 6 foot when I graduated high school, and I grew about 2 inches afterwards. So
Okay, so nothing too crazy.
yeah.
Dr. Fuchs, our department chair, like I grew probably another inch or two after high school also. He actually had his growth spurt after high school. Like he literally grew, I think he said almost 6 inches. So when he went back for his high school reunion, like he graduated high school like 5'8", and then now he's like 6'2". So when he showed up, everybody's like, what the happened to Eric? Because turns out the joys of how we all develop at different ages. Now,
At the end of my sophomore year, I was like 5'9".
oh yeah, so you definitely did do some sprouting up as you went through.
Yep.
Nice. So we're going to find that when we're growing our bones in circumference, and circumference is going to increase our ability to deal with forces because it turns out we now have got a wider base effectively. This is going to occur mostly on the inner layer, what's known as the peristeum, okay? Now, these membranes is going to be where we're going to have bones or cells known as osteoblasts that are going to be increasing the size and the strength of it, whereas osteoclasts are going to be removing calcium. Now, calcium, as some of you already know from exercise phys, and you guys are going to learn, is very important for muscular contraction. So if you don't have enough calcium for muscular contraction, your body is going to take it from the only place where you store it, and that's your bones. And if we keep pulling from our bones, we're going to slowly decrease our bone mineral density until potentially we risk injuring ourselves. And specifically, I won't pick on Colleen again because she's already been picked on enough this morning. When you're looking at a lot of long distance runners, a number of them have issues with stress fractures. And that's literally partially caused nutritionally by not getting enough calcium, along with, and I'll kind of skip ahead, magnesium, vitamin D, and vitamin K that are all related to increasing bone mineral density because the body prioritizes muscle function over bone health because it's more important to be able to run away from whatever is trying to make you its meal or try to catch your meal than it is to potentially break a bone. Now, when it comes to growth, you literally are changing your density and diameter your entire life. So whenever you start long distance running, you start lifting weights, you do anything that is increasing the stress through your skeleton and what you're used to beforehand, your bone mineral density is going to go up. And whenever you're doing less, you're being more sedentary, you're being less active, it's going to go down. Now, as far as the growing in length, usually, if you guys, actually it's kind of fun from our little poll in the class, it's going to be somewhere between 15 and 25. Most folks, it's usually going to be probably between 14 and 19, but obviously it's a bell curve and you'll have some people on one end and you'll have some people on the other. In fact, it was, gosh, what's his name? Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman is another example of a person that grew, I think it was over half a foot, and maybe it was even more than that, had a growth spurt when he was in his 20s. That's why he didn't really do too well with collegiate basketball because he started off as a point guard and ended up by the end of it being a forward because it turns out he had gained that much height. Now, how's the structure affected strength? Well, it is coming down to what's known as the anisotropic properties of bone, which is it's always going to depend on the direction of the load. So your skeleton, specifically your lower body, for the most part is used to just pushing forward straight down into the ground. Same thing with your hands. If you're doing lifting or otherwise, it's going to be that force that's being absorbed up and down the chain. Now, you can do things that introduce forces in different directions. So the aforementioned arm wrestling. You not just have to practice arm wrestling in order to literally increase the strength of your muscles and improve the neurological control in those positions. You literally need to do it to increase the bone mineral density to resist that shearing force, so you're literally less likely to break it. Same thing could be said about individuals that are kickboxers, where they're kicking people with their shins. Their shin will actually increase that bone mineral density through the shaft to deal with that greater amount of force. And if you, once again, want to watch something that's very cringeworthy, you can see, ooh, nice Blaine, you can see videos of people fracturing their tibia and fibula, kicking another person because obviously their bones were not dense enough to deal with the force that they could produce through their hips, through their knee, that then that tibia had to tolerate. Now, Blaine has a good question about how long does it take for bone mineral density to adapt to new demands? Well, it's trying to do so immediately. So as soon as you're effectively giving it a signal that it needs to get stronger, it's going to adapt as quickly as it can. Now, the problem is your circulation to your bones is very poor. And on top of that, you need to make sure that you have effectively all of the different types of brick and mortar in order to increase that bone mineral density, which means you need to have enough calcium, you need to have enough vitamin D, vitamin K, and magnesium, along with protein in general for the collagen synthesis. So as far as rates of increasing bone mineral density, that is a great question, and I cannot give you a really great answer on how much you can enhance it in a short period of time. But I would say that the ability to increase your bone mineral density by, say, about 1% over the course of a month, we've seen that before on a DEXA scanner, which is obviously not nothing. But if you compare that to things like strength increases, it's not that quick. But then again, we have not really tried to clinically increase bone mineral density. And honestly, I don't work with the elderly population where you're going to obviously be far more interested in getting that bone mineral density to massively increase. Does that make sense? I'll go with definitely maybe. So if we injure our bones, thank you, Blaine, at too young of an age, we can literally cause the closure of those growth plates. And if it happens in one limb over the other, you're literally going to have one limb that can be longer than the other. So it's important, like anything else, to just be smart. Yes, you want kids to be going out there and taking part in a variety of different physical activities. So they're getting a variety of different stresses in the body. They're having to improve their neurological control. They're having to obviously learn a lot of not just tactical decisions, but social interactions with other human beings. And it is important to make sense that whenever people do hit that growth spurt, literally your bones can grow in length faster than your muscles can become longer, meaning like stretch out. And because of this, individuals can have what's known as growing pains. I never grew fast enough that growing pains were a real problem. But you guys feel free to throw up in the chat if you had legitimate growing pains, because it literally can happen that the bones are growing so quickly that there's pain, and it's gonna be like, can be cramping in the legs and otherwise, because literally their muscles are being stretched out, even though they're not in what you would consider to be a lengthened position, because they're not able to keep up. And then this is going to negatively affect mobility. So hence, when you're working with your athletes, and specifically if you're working with high school age, middle school age athletes, when they start hitting that growth spurt, to be mindful of the intensity and volume of training you're applying to them, because their body is changing, and that's already pretty, ooh, that does not sound like a good time, Cam. I know my wife had him to a certain extent. She was full grown when she was 12. She was, 5'10". So yeah, that's obviously can be a real issue depending on who you're working with. Now, how our bones respond to stress is in accordance with what's known as Wolff's Law, which is we're constantly building bone through osteoblasts. And interesting, Evan. Evan wrote, he grew a lot during the 6th grade summer and could hardly walk because of the pain of his knees. Yeah, the joys of getting taller. Now, I'm going to say that first and foremost, I'm a little jealous of how tall you guys are. So if that's a cost of admission, you win some, you lose some. But on the same, but in the true vein of it, it's to be mindful of the fact of when you have an individual that's growing at a rapid rate, that's taking up a lot of resources in the human body. And obviously it's going to be leading to a lot of issues, both acutely with pain and then potentially setting them up for injury if you're not mindful of those changes you're going to see. Now, once again, through Wolff's Law, the osteoblasts building our bones and the osteoclasts taking it away, we are constantly increasing and decreasing our bone mineral density thanks to the mechanical stress. So we need to apply enough stress to maintain our bone mineral density. So for example, I know Blaine, have you been able to lift weights, Blaine, or you've been stuck not really being able to do much lifting since everything happened? Good. So now do you have enough weight where you're lifting, or have you had to go lightly? Okay, so he's got a barbell, so he's all right. Now, if Blaine went, because I know he really likes to do heavy lifting, specifically things like heavy squatting and front squatting at that, if he was only able to do body weight squats, if we put him in a DEXA before everything happened, and then a DEXA once he can start getting back to true barbell lifting, we would probably see his bone mineral density's gone down. And the reason for it is he doesn't have, or he hasn't had to do that heavy lifting and deal with those greater impacts for quite some time. Now, whereas for some of you guys, let's say if you're stuck at home and at home, you used to really enjoy, let's say playing basketball, and well, it turns out, I guess you can shoot on your own, but you got a barbell and stuff in the basement, and now you start lifting weights. You might see an increase in your bone mineral density because it turns out now you're overcoming greater loads. And it's not just everything increases. It is the tissues you're using. So if you were to take your average bro at the rec and you look at their bone mineral density compared to where it once was, well, it turns out if they never do legs, their bone mineral density in their upper body, in their arms, even in the ribs from the bar touching their chest and things like the bench press, if they go down that far, you're going to see an increase in bone mineral density. But you're not going to see that increase in bone mineral density in their hips, in their femurs, and their tibias, because they're not dealing with greater force going through their legs, because they're not doing things like heavy squatting or Olympic lifting. So it's important to keep in mind, we're constantly remodeling, and we're remodeling according to the amount of stress and where that stress is being applied. So if you're not doing weight bearing, if you're doing a lot of things where you happen to be in an environment where you're not having to deal with gravity, like you're in a pool and you're swimming, you're not getting all of those signals to increase bone mineral density. Now, this isn't problematic for just sedentary individuals, but it's literally for people that have gone and are astronauts. Most of the astronauts, whenever they get back, and now this is back in the day, whenever they had the space, the shuttle, people would come back down and, they do the hero walk down the side of the shuttle from the stairs to the ground and then, walk off. What was typically waiting for them when they got back is literally wheelchairs, because that amount of movement was a maximal effort, because both their muscles and their bones have been detrained because of how low the stress is on the body, even when doing a bit of exercising when you happen to be in space. In fact, I'll finish on a little story. One of my old advisors did research literally with Russian cosmonauts and astronauts that were on the International Space Station. And what was fascinating with those astronauts is their typical way of working out was there was an exercise, there was this bike. So they would ride the bike, and if you rode the bike for 2 hours, you technically rode around the world, because that's how fast the ISSN literally orbits the planet. Now, the Russians, they had the treadmill, and the treadmill was effectively, you were harnessed in, and it was like doing walking lunges, because there's no motor in it, because that would have been heavier. Instead, you just have to push and kind of keep driving yourself against this treadmill. And at the end of the study, they did biopsies and bone mineral density scans pre and post, obviously going up into the International Space Station. I think they were up there for at least a number of months. But the fun fact that it never was published in the actual data, but I got to see the raw data, is most of the cosmonauts, because they were doing walking lunges, they maintained their muscle mass, and even one of them increased his muscle mass from doing effectively weighted walking lunges every single day. But the Americans, because they rode the bike, their muscle mass went down and their bone mineral density went down. And of course, they're not going to publish an article talking about how Americans are soft in the space station and the Russians are the ones getting after it. But I always thought that was interesting because it literally shows, once again, our body is constantly adapting to the stimulus around it. You're only as strong as you need to be to get through your life. You only have as much endurance as you need to get through your life. Your body's not trying to get you any better than you need to be to just get by. So hence, we need to be mindful of stimulus, understand the mechanisms of how we get those responses and the timeline for them. So, any other questions, guys? Or are you guys good to go for today? Yeah, Blaine, they suck. I ran into Jasper. Yeah, I told you guys on Monday, and we did that, and my hips have almost forgiven me. And then today I'm at a deadlift, so woo! And telling you guys, seriously, the Taylor Fork Hill back in the ecological area, that is a darn good hill to do sprints up. I've started doing those, and if you guys are ever interested, shoot me an email, and I'll let you know when I'm going to be over there, and you guys are more than welcome to join. So, miss you guys. Stay safe out there, and yeah. Yeah, be good to each other, and hopefully this stuff is over sooner rather than later. Have questions, always feel free to contact me. All right, guys, bye-bye.